She would have been so nice to teach in the 18th century when music teaching englobed performance and composing, therefore interpretation englobed improvisation. But of course in the style of the day, since nobody lived long enough to survive or long enough to study the past, or the past was not so well conserved as today, in all the layers of the past, which makes us so much more, if educated, informed, but then perhaps end up by becoming self-censored because of the overwhelming amount of information, which then has to be categorized and put into the contexts. But ultimately, if we play music from other time periods on different instruments with different ear psyche and all, probably the whole problem started at the beginning of the 20th century when recordings and developed, publishers also in numbers, music schools also. On most continents as the century progressed, and therefore there was this standardization that became so much perhaps a separation in the education also for the musical knowledge. In fact, you cannot be a flute student and a composer at the same time, or you could, but today you have to choose, or you should have chosen already in the 20th century, so that the performers are separate from the composers, separate from the music thinkers, the musicologists, separate from the conductors or the other kind of theorizing music. In other words, different ways of serving the muse, but nevertheless, very few combine, and if they do, they're considered not professional, because you cannot be good at many trades by essence. And then the fact that I think the people were composers when they were performers in, let's say, Mozart's time, and read music together when they gathered to rehearse, not really, never rehearsed, they read, and that was the performance, is that in fact all of them studied composition enough to know how to compose, most likely because there was no recordings, they had to provide constantly fresh live music for the different patrons. And so not all of the music was revolutionarily great, or incredibly importantly inspired. Probably it was well done, but perhaps not very spiritually elevated. I mean, not everybody's Mozart, Haydn, but there must have been this plethora of people around who also did write and fulfill the musical needs of the patrons, as well as survive for themselves, for their calling. And I find that in a way the global holistic knowledge of music was privileged to the specific aspect of professionalization. Of course, again, because the knowledge base is so large, people consider naturally that you have to choose early which branch you go through. And in a way, you can change branch, but you cannot combine. If you do, well, it doesn't last too long, because nobody takes you seriously. Anyway, nobody takes you seriously. But when you teach, as I do, and when you have the consciousness and the respect for the student, you want them to be successful. You want them to be recognized for their knowledge as well as for their artistry. Of course, for who they are to start with. They didn't come to be spoon-fed by you as a teacher, but you have the responsibility if they ask you which tempo, which phrasing, which direction, which ornament, which decoration, can we exchange or not? Do we improvise a cadenza? Yes, perhaps not. Or write it, or perhaps play somebody else's cadenza. What about other sections of the pieces? Can we improvise them? Mostly not, even if it was a tradition, but we're not in that time period. Today we have some very bright scholars who can play beautifully the piano as well, and therefore their incredibly deep knowledge of their scholarship is what makes them unquestionable. But when, as a teacher, you send young people to become future teachers, they go through auditions, processes, and exams to finish a degree, and an audition to get a job, and all this. They have to constantly prove their professionalism. And you teach them piano, and they have to play in Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin, and perhaps before Bach, and perhaps much closer to us. So all kinds of idioms and languages which, when they studied individually, the 18th or 19th century, they only studied the music of their time mostly. I mean, firstly, perhaps, if not mostly. And then they developed a skill for opera or a skill for quartet if they were successful, or none. Not everybody was successful, and it's unfair, but at the same time, if there was a calling and then very few succeeded, and they had to be really courageous to survive by believing in themselves, but also by combining this industrial quantity of handmade music. There was no computer and photocopy machines. Chopin had to copy 3 times most of his pieces to publish by 3 countries, in England, France, and Germany. Oh, many details must have been gone, most unlikely willingly, but perhaps sometimes were, and mostly perhaps was just unwillingly. Discrepancies happen anyway when you don't aim at it. Copying anything, just try, you'll see. I remember as a child I copied the well-tempered clavier before I played it for my teacher, in order to learn it first in the voice leading before the keys. But when you copy even a part for an orchestra piece, so all this to say that they corrected the mistakes in their reading performances for these patrons or their patrons. So in fact, the global musicianship was perhaps less technically involved in the instrumental knowledge. That's probably true. The violinists played less virtuoso, the flutists played less complicated techniques, but perhaps they can all sight read a woodwind quintet or a string quartet that was composed for a performance, mostly because the language was common, the grammar, the expectation of the style. They didn't wonder, am I playing the trill on the upper note? Am I finishing the trill with a semitone termination? And what if the first note of the trill is before the trill in anticipation of the real note? Then can I play the upper note as an appoggiatura? But I was told, that you play on the upper note in the Baroque on the real note after. And what if it's in Mozart or Haydn? It's just after Baroque. Who defines when it stops? Of course, most of these notated details become interpretations in the sincere sense of the translation of the intent of the composer through the filter of the notation or the publisher. How much that was between them also, with some, let's say, dissonances of understanding or follow-up. Perhaps he didn't have time to follow up all the corrections. And then through the time we have more and better, more precise, more trusted editions, the urtext, the original text. All this fine-tuned search for authenticity really bursted around World War II, especially after into the second half of the 20th century. I doubt very much that Horowitz, Rubinstein, Lipati, great pianists, I mean, I cannot name them all, but meaning mostly shaped by the early 20th or the late 19th century, Rao, Clara Haskell, that I don't think authenticity of the score was their essential goal. Of course, they had the patina of, or the approved stamp of a given school of tradition, the Russian school of music, the German school. I mean, Rao went from Chile to study in Berlin, and then, I mean, there were this competitive Cortot French school, and then the Russian school. Which created a sense of tradition, and then certain tempi were Germanic different, and the articulation and the legato in Russia, where the technique was to play with the fingers entirely connected to the keys magnetically constantly and use the elbows to relax the wrist. I studied with Richter, I remember very well that. And I think that then the sound approach is different when you have in pianistic technique that is the tradition that you have to perpetuate, even if the personalities, after all, Gilels and Richter had little in common the way they played the piano, even if, of course, they're both Russian school representatives, at least were among many. And then you had the French school, was supposed to be the pearled touch, jeu perlé. But not all French pianists played pearl touch. For instance, Pierre Sancan, who was a student of Yves Nat, he was admirative when I was studying with him at the conservatory of the Russian school, which was playing in depth and more. So the tempi were slower in the Russian than fast in the French. At least the examples I have personally lived through. Conductors in Germany also conducting the Beethoven First Concerto twice slower than in Paris for the same piece, and I was there surprised when I thought, oh, wow, they have a global agreement on the classical tempi. So much of my childhood naivete. But you know, at the end of it, we remain a lot of it, perhaps not all, and not all have to remain naive. I don't characterize that we should or we shouldn't. I mean, we are as we are individually, and thankfully we are all individuals who try to serve the muse, answering the call, and then following our traditions or our upbringing. And I'm very, very open-minded in the sense of accepting the different points of view. I don't think we should be only, well, of course it helps to be very structuring the students' choices in order to make them more successful, because you have to guide them through the forbidden things so they can break the forbidden things in order to create their own freedom. So I understand that teaching is rigor as well as excitement, or rigor as well as enthusiasm, informed knowledge as well as intuitive playing. And I think it's so important to keep the balance of the two, because the self-esteem, the being comfortable with their own choices musically for these budding young professionals who come to trust me when they study with me, I take it at heart. I really do. And of course, I listen to each of their creative personalities, however they show, or they dare, or they are taught not to, or they are. And I don't try to be just eccentric for the sake of it and say, oh, why don't you do that because that was the tradition in this and their time. I think we have to be more pragmatic. I want to make sure that when they go through the audition process and they are heard by people in juries, that they reach the consensus for what they're worth for their own musicianship. Once they're established in their field and they develop perhaps some of the grains of the things that I suggested for them to think outside of the box, or according to the way people thought outside of our time period, but adapted to their already mature capacity to filter all these possible, in many ways, contradictions. Like, everybody likes the piece, but their own way. And so as many teachers you see sometimes on the same piece in a given festival, you can have this variety of opinions that borderline the contradictions of most things, between the ornaments, the notation, the tempi, the phrasing, the tradition, the expectation. And fine, that's a rich capacity. It's the problem of the rich. The poor had no access. They didn't know anybody. When I was a child, I trusted my teacher. I didn't have YouTube to compare dead and living pianists playing my piece before my lesson. And inevitably, it is necessarily also something to take in account when I teach today, because my students are way more informed about the different interpretations of their piece than I was at their time, when I was discovering for the first time the piece like they are now. And so, of course, I know through the path of their life, they will develop a knowledge of the piece through the second, third, fourth, fifth visitation, as I call it, of the piece, when they will replay it or record it or teach it or write about it or all the above. In other words, it will travel with them. And so you can think, okay, first things first. They have to have the technique to express their artistry. There is no artistry without technique, because you betray your own intuition. But once you have to make a choice, then for the interpretation, you have to accept, is an adagio, a marking on the metronome by Melzel's, well, he's the one who marketed the metronome in the early 19th century in Vienna. Or is it just an adagio, which means at ease, like an andante where you take your time, which was mostly of the indications of the moods for the tempo marking before the more objective metronome marking, which followed the indication with a number per beats a minute. So the objective facts come later, but then how do you interpret an adagio in Mozart, an adagio in Bach, compared to an andante? Did they have the same ratio than Melzel when he marketed the metronome and put them in the different level of groups of speed of tempi a beat a minute? How can I say? I think that ultimately, and I hope my students understand this from my teaching, is that while I can open their horizons wide open about the context, the style, the character, the way people perceived the genre of this music, how the genre of this music evolved through the time, how people who wrote Sarabande in 1790 were different from the people who wrote it in 1720, because the perception of the dance was already different and evolved. And then this is kind of thing that you can see, okay, these have to practice 11 hours a day on the piano to get technique for international competition. They don't have time to go into this details. This is for musicologists. Don't fill up their brain with too much of this knowledge, because ultimately what will they do with it? At most or worst, they'll confuse them more. Help them with several rules and directions and directives rather than directions. Of course, I think that I try my best between undergrad and graduate to make a difference between the importance of giving templates in the examples, also explanations for the choices, not only by example, as well as formal explanations about structures and some kind of importance that you have to right away instillate in the student about being serious, in the sense responsible. You know, what you do with the repeat is not just I take it or not if I don't have time, and I'm afraid the audience will get bored if I don't do differently the second time. No, it's way more than just trying to, so to say, give a makeup to it and make it attractive the second time, because who knows, people will get bored. No, of course not. I think there is something about credibility, about credentials, about having a deep conviction about why am I playing a piece the way it's written, and I want to play it with my conviction. Accept to change mind, perhaps after the performance or in several years when you revisit the piece. And I think it's part of evolution with life. You learn more about other compositions. You learn, Mozart sonatas, operas. You realize how they reflect each other, or quartets compared to sonatas. And then you say the same thing with Haydn, symphonies with quartets and sonatas, or mass or religious works like Mozart's and Haydn's and Beethoven's, and you realize that, yes, they nourish your understanding of the piece that you play for the instrument for which you play, even if it's not the original per se, if you play the modern piano, I mean. But these things cannot be poured at once in the brain, psyche, in the horizons of the micro. I was going to say almost a micro bubble, but in a way, it is a microcosm that you build around the student to give them the choices of the tempo, the phrasing, the pedaling, the articulation, the harmonization, the melodic line, the voicing, the secondary voices, the breathing, the sense of breathing compared to the metronome, the phrasing compared to the group of bars. In other words, you do use some analytical interpretation in order to bring them to have a structural understanding, but then how they play it with the rubato, a little or too much or not enough. nobody can agree, but they have to find their own level where you can tell them, I think beyond this is too much. But before that, you have some margin where you can experiment, either because you merge into a second theme in a slower tempo, but you don't go under the tempo to catch it up, but you just progressively prepare to enter there. So you have some strategic choices to make for the length of sound, for the decay, compared to the acoustic or the instrument. So the tempo then changes, but then the mood changes, and also the structures of the rest change. So you can, there are parameters that you can clearly define for the student, and I do. And at the same time, I observe how their individual drive that brought them in the first place to play piano since childhood, for some more or less early, in their childhoods, meaning everybody has a different history. But the point is that they come to me at some point of their development or their path in music, in piano, in knowledge, or in experience, or lack of, obviously, performance, the stress, the fright, and then the confidence. But what makes you confident? Is it just because you read the book about it, or the extra pages of the score that almost nobody, unfortunately, reads about the details of the authenticity of the score, and Henle has them at the end of the page of the book? No, I think it's because somehow each of them finds their own blend of how much they need of the knowledge and how much they need of their drive in order to justify their relentless, courageous, daily, ephemeral, new practicing, until they reach the point where they become more reliable than less, and they can deal with the unexpected on stage. And I help them with that because I want them to have reliable fingerings, no matter what, if I may say, shiftings, preparations, artistic, but also precise, technical ways to reach these artistic choices that they might or not make right away, more or less eccentric, or more or less respectful, or more or less just polite, because we recite the text, and then afterwards we might develop more of our personality, and that's fine if some do it right away, some do it later, but I don't push them to, because I think it's a disservice. It's not respecting them, but it's not respecting them either not to give them any of this multi-directional information, from the authenticity to the experience, through the tradition, and the whole knowledge of the music of a given composer, but the piece that they play, in order to situate it then in the structural development of theirs, if they wrote for different styles in a longer lifetime, if they lived longer than a Schubert, a Mozart, a Chopin, but more like a Brahms, a Beethoven, relatively so, but still a Bach, who didn't evolve much in his style, but still they lived longer for their time periods than others. Of course, we'll never know the late works of Schubert, Chopin, and we can always wonder what they would have been. How would have they overlap with the evolution of music the way we know it? How will they have been perhaps like Rachmaninoff, holding back on tonal system when so many had gone atonal? Is it because of his pianistic trait? Possibly, but when we listen to his music, we don't listen to it chronologically. We think of it just for the beauty of what it is, and we listen to Schoenberg and further for what it is too. And of course, when we put it in certain kind of chronology, we'll say, wow, Debussy wrote already so progressive when Brahms was still old enough to write some more tonal pieces. Tonal, atonal, that's a joke too. I mean, of course, it depends of the composer's necessity to express themselves. After all, the grammar and the common language is, what is it? It's a tool to be understood. But then the poet chooses the words for the sound of the words, not only for the meaning of the words, but also. So you can say the same for a foreign language. You understand the meaning more than all the secondary meanings, because it's perhaps not as comfortable as your mother tongue, where you have all the innuendos before even you were pointed out at them by a given literature teacher. I still think that all this acquired knowledge should blend to become as natural as the intuitive knowledge, like the mother tongue by ear, compared to the second or third languages which you learn by grammar, by the eyes originally, and then put it in the mouth and have an accent like I do, unfortunately, in English. But I realized that to acquire and to continue and to have the flame that started it all and continue having it, it's partly also the teacher's responsibility, at least I feel it. Not to crush them with too much knowledge, too much analysis, too much technique, just enough for each, but tailored in a way for each student. You have to listen to their cravings and their fears and their hopes and their where are their vulnerabilities and where are their strengths, and where they're fearless and where they are convinced and convincing, and help them become even more. So the technique secures, but the also musical, artistic, interpretational choices have to be solidly grounded. Between uninformed, over-informed, I have to take the risk to sometimes a little over-informed rather than uninformed. I find it's respecting them for the young adults that they are when they come to study with me. Here, at this point. Sometimes I teach children who are so incredibly intuitively driven that you feel like they already know what you have to teach them because they guess it intuitively. And that is another problem when they grow up, to find a way to refill the proportions of the fluids. But in terms of the pure intuition, even in young adults, especially in young adults, I want it to be very strong, because they will spend a lot of time practicing because they get impatient with the technical shortcomings, and they risk tendinitis because they will over practice because of short dead ends, that was Freudian, dead lines that become dead ends if they have a tendinitis. That's what I wanted to say. So I had tried to make sure they study wisely so they don't come up with this awareness to catch up gaps that they have in their early development, technically, for instance, or musically, or both. You see, taking it at heart is passionately driven me. I'm driven for it. But yeah, I sometimes started saying to you, wow, what would it have been to teach a performer who composed in the end of the 18th century? Keyboard harmony, contrapoint, fugue, techniques, scales, exercises, interpretation, but in transposition, as well as, of course, improvisation, decoration compared to ornamentation, which is exchangeable with what and how. Gather a know-how that is closer to a craftsmanship than only artistry purely. It's not contradictory, actually, because then you become a better hearing person and better critical person about which choice of tone you want for which tempo, in which phrasing, with which direction it brings you where, what is the narrative psyche of the piece, and how you want it to bring it to where, and if it's fragmented or connected or organized or with a run-on sentence. It's all about connected to all kinds of literature innuendos, because it's narration, after all, in a language of its own, within a style and a time period, and inevitably genres and forms. All this awareness is just fascinating. How much can one young brain absorb and how much it loses as well. I know it as a student. I thought, my God, after a lesson with my teacher, I would come out of there feeling like I'll forget 90% of all this, which is so important each individually. What will I do? At least I had the awareness I could not remember all of it. So the concentration capacity, the length of concentration capacity of the student probably is the key to the student's success ultimately, artistically and musically through their life. It's probably true for everything, not only music. But not all brains are capable the same way. In a certain way, they have predispositions to think, abstractly, and others not, and some with more images and some with more sounds, and some we all have perhaps a different way to to access our intelligence through a different sense, the taste buds, the sounds, the touch, the intellect, the combination of this or that. It's fascinating how all of us are different when facing what supposed to make us, if we are successful, very comparable, and then we go to competitions to be compared and evaluated and ranked, which is another thing that drives me a little bit worried, that sometimes this ranking overtakes the importance of the grounding for each individual to develop all their capacities, but they will develop them anyway. I mean, there is a healthy portion to the competitivity in the studies as well during the years of formative years, between the amount of repertoire to learn, the amount of knowledge about it to have, the technique in order to be able to play it, the experience to perform it in audiences or in front of people, regardless if they're professionals to judge you or non-professionals for whom it's a storytelling and you feel more perhaps free to tell them, and then combine all that with the knowledge about the techniques that are evolved and how you adapt to the unexpected of it. This piano, that piano responds this way, this keys, this pedal holds longer there. How you adapt, you organize on the spot, because you have to be the ear to finger through brain speed to react with a soul, wherever it is, in the heart or somewhere. For the music, you're your conductor, your orchestra, and your audience at the same time, by yourself. When you practice, mostly lonely for the pianist compared to string players who work in quartets or in orchestra right away from the get-go. Woodwinds, they learn how to merge their sounds. Pianists in four hands, they cannot even play a chord together because they don't study basically to merge their sounds and their articulations and their touches. Because they're individual, even concerti, they study them mostly as sonatas until they play with orchestra or second piano one day, which at the end comes too late, in fact, because by then they know it as an individual piece and not part of a whole. And of course, it's so many reasons for which we can help them to get the hint of it, so that when they prepare it, they don't over pedal, because the string orchestra, let's say harmonic pedal, compensates the pedal of the piano. So you do it because you play alone in a studio that's dry acoustically and the piano might be not good. But then when you play it on a beautiful piano, great acoustics, and you put the pedal and the strings cover with it, then it becomes blurry. But then, by then, it's too late to unlearn before that rehearsal all what you accumulated before in your mnemotechnic knowledge of the pedal freezing according to the touch and the sound, because you practice it alone. And it's economically impossible to practice every 16 bars with orchestra once a week until you get the piece to known. That would be a dream come true, but I don't think any school of music would have economically the capacity to provide that for their students. I do sometimes do that when I accompany them on the second piano in a concerto, and I do everything an orchestra would do to bother them. Rush when it's difficult for them, and slow down when it's easier for them, because the orchestra has, the conductor, their own agenda as well in the pieces. Of course, the piece is not always a dialogue between the two parts, solo and orchestra, but nevertheless, the second pianist usually tends to follow what the first pianist do in the solo part, because after all, they're a sparring partner after all. But with the orchestra, the soloist feels all of a sudden that they are not in charge to their articulation to conduct the orchestra. Not that the conductor is bypassed, but in the playing itself. And so you have to become, in fact, aware of that when you practice it as a soloist, that you play with others. But I think still the pianist, from all the other musicians who play an instrument, practice mostly lonely and perform mostly lonely. So inevitably it creates a sense of different type of musicianship. Narcissism, self-fulfillment. Not all, and some, but it's just part of the trade. And the instrument, you don't have to deal with the intonation, because it's in tune or out of tune. Most of us don't know how to tune it, so unfortunately myself too. So we're helpless. But intonation for a string player, a singer, or wind player is such an important part. And we don't have a pedal, we can. So with the right foot pedal, we might blurry bit some things that we're afraid might show up not very well. Oh, not that it's really the truth. I mean, they don't use it for that. But okay, I'm being humorous here. But now, I think they do it because it sounds good. And the recordings are well reverberated, and they love them when they listen to them. And when they practice in a room that doesn't resonate, the sound sounds dry. So they put more pedal. It's like putting more sauce if you find the food is dry. We cannot sound like the MP3s when we practice, though we dream to imitate the pianists we like and we listen to. And that's healthy too. In fact, everything is healthy except excesses, right? Easy to say, difficult to do. The one who says it is the one who, don't do what I say. No, do what I say, don't do what I do, right? Lead by example, sure. Well, that was fun sharing with you a lot of these doubts and convictions at the same time about teaching the kids to play well, meaning adults play well, meaning the artists play well, the potential colleagues play well, the potential playing better than you play well. Because after all, etymologically, in a way, pedagogy leads to being surpassed by the pupil surpasses the master. Not that I'm a master, but the pupil can surpass. I still think we are all pupil as it is, but with different amount of hours on our flying. And some of us swim against the tide longer than others. Oh boy. Technique, technique, technique.